This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to journalist and risk analyst Raffi Elliott. He's going to be talking to us about the situation in Armenia. He's been on the ground in Goris, where over 120,000 refugees from Artsakh or Karabakh are fleeing now that Azerbaijan has bombed their region, blockaded the area, starved the people. There's already footage of Azeri troops committing war crimes, killing civilians, looting their homes. Naturally, all Armenians are leaving. Raffi's been on the ground. He's going to talk to us about the situation. Support us at patreon.com/popularfront. Let's talk about what has happened. The last time we did an episode on the situation in Karabakh or Artsakh, it was just unfolding. And since then, it's only been a week or two. Since then, unfortunately, I mean, it's kind of over as far as Armenians living there peacefully in any way possible in the future. So just explain to us kind of what's happened over the last week since Azerbaijan started bombing.
Right. So it's been, at the time of this recording, it's been exactly 1 week since the latest ceasefire was agreed upon. For a very short recap, on September 19th at exactly 1 p.m. local time, Azerbaijan launched what it calls a lightning attack against, again, what it calls to be terrorist targets inside the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. This attack lasted almost exactly 24 hours of sustained bombing with high caliber artillery and cruise missiles, which hit a number of military targets that the local militia had been maintaining, but also indiscriminately bombed a number of civilian centers, and in some cases, based on conversations I've had with survivors, deliberately targeted civilian settlements. This was then followed by a ground advance, which encircled a number of the major population centers in the region, and eventually forced the local authorities to capitulate. These people, just for reference, had been besieged for 9 months and had basically been starved and cut off from the rest of the world, despite the presence of a 2,000-strong Russian peacekeeper contingent. Since then, the local authorities have negotiated face-to-face with the Azerbaijani government, although it isn't quite clear what has and hasn't been agreed upon. The Azeri government said that they would only negotiate the full surrender of Nagorno-Karabakh and its reintegration into the Azerbaijani Republic. However, despite them claiming that they had a reintegration plan ready to go, it's been a week and that plan has not been made public, and really the exact opposite of reintegration is taking place right now.
The Azeris have said officially, oh no, we're not going to kick anybody out, everyone can live here peacefully, but that's not been the case, right? They've started spiriting people away. An Armenian philanthropist, he's just gone, well, not missing, he's been arrested. They wanted to arrest all of the, essentially any males that were in the military, right? Commanders essentially leading the resistance to this bombing that Azerbaijan did. And over 120,000 people have left. There's been videos of torture. There's been videos of Azeri forces just randomly shooting civilian homes. Videos of Azeris ransacking people's homes, looting, laughing about it. Videos of Azeri forces shooting ancient Armenian heritage out there. What's the situation like now? How likely is it that anyone is going to stay? Is it literally everyone is leaving, like all the Armenians are gone?
So I mean, you already gave a pretty good description of the situation. Indeed, Azerbaijan insists that it only targeted military targets. It's borrowing a lot of the language that you typically tend to hear from Israeli military commanders when they talk about surgical strikes into Gaza or the West Bank. Uh, Although obviously this was not the case. Um, we have many stories that I have personally heard from people I met at the border while I was there, in which they say that they were deliberately targeted. In some cases, they fled their villages and hid in the forest. When Azerbaijani artillery spotters noticed them, they redirected artillery specifically onto them. In cases in which families lost young children, uh, others came, of course, with stories of villages which had been overrun by the Azeris before the Russian peacekeepers could get to them, in which the entire populations have been murdered. This We have some evidence of this having happened in at least 4 villages at the moment, although it's still hard to get some facts on the ground because, of course, Azerbaijan has refused to allow international monitors to enter the region altogether. But indeed, as you kind of just said, Azerbaijan has this one official narrative that it's been pushing in the press very hard, that they want reintegration of the Armenian community, or as they call them, the Armenian citizens of the Azerbaijani citizens of Armenian descent, because they're trying to remove their agency and indigenous status to the region. And just the term itself, reintegration, is kind of cynical because this region was never part of or functionally part of a Republic of Azerbaijan. It was connected to the region formally by Stalin at a time in which internal borders between the republics didn't mean anything, since it was the Soviet Union. It was just a matter of symbolism. And this region, of course, declared its independence from the Soviet Union a month before Azerbaijan did. And then this is in 1991, and then faced the repercussions of that when Azerbaijan then tried to forcefully integrate the region and then lost. So functionally, this region has never been part of a state of Azerbaijan. The local people never paid taxes to Baku. They don't use the Azeri currency. They don't serve in the Azeri army. They don't listen to the Azeri police force. They don't speak Azeri, right? I mean, generations upon generations of them have been born having never met an Azeri in their lives until a week ago. Um, and those Azeris that they met were pointing guns at them. So there's there's a really very little realistic possibility of any sort of integration or reintegration of this population. And as you said, the Azeris have also been systematically humiliating those people who were captured. They've been bulldozing their homes, and they've been pulling down any monument to Armenianness in the region in the parts of Nagorno-Karabakh that they captured. Within 30 hours of the ceasefire being signed, the Azeris came and with a crane and removed a very famous Armenian monument to the First War. It's this tank monument. I think you may have seen it, Jake, when you were there. Um, so they removed that before they even allowed to send humanitarian aid into the region, which had been blockaded and starved for 9 months. So it tells you what their priorities are, is to completely destroy the region's Armenianness and to make it impossible to live there as an Armenian. So nobody there has any illusions as to what the situation is. Every person that I've spoken to when they crossed the border, and I've spoken to maybe hundreds of people at this point, and amongst Armenians, the Armenians of Karabakh, or the Artsakh Armenians, as we call them, kind of have a reputation for being extremely stubborn people. They indeed fought now 3 wars with Azerbaijan for their land. So they're not the types of people that would abandon their homes very easily. But even they knew that the writing was on the wall. They knew that if indeed Azerbaijan was giving them a choice to stay or to leave, it was more about a choice to leave or to die. And they decided that human lives were simply just more important than land.
So no one's staying.
That's a good question. So At the time we're speaking, the latest numbers of refugees crossing into Armenia is around 55,000. For reference, at its height, Nagorno-Karabakh had roughly 150,000 Armenians. But after the 2020 war, in which some sections had been overrun by the Azerbaijanis, some 30,000 of them relocated elsewhere or into Armenia. So 120,000 had been left until the events of last week. So 55,000, we're talking about 45% of the entire population of Nagorno Karabakh has now left the republic and entered Armenia. And that's probably an undercount because at this point, so many cars have entered what is essentially a two-lane country road, that it's possible that emergency services inside Armenia have lost the exact track of how many people have entered. But anyway, this is to give you context. The border, the Lachin corridor, which is the lifeline connecting the what is basically an exclave with Armenia proper, had been blocked from December 7th, 2022, and then basically reopened 2 days after the ceasefire, or 3 days after the ceasefire. So roughly this Saturday. So in the last 4.5 to 5 days, we've seen 55,000 people enter Armenia through this one road. And what you're essentially seeing on the other side is state collapse. The government of Nagorno-Karabakh now basically is on its dying legs. It controls about 5 or 10% of the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, where all the remaining Armenians are currently located. We do not know if there are Armenians behind Azerbaijani lines right now, and if they are, we don't know if they're alive because there is absolutely no contact with them. So, for all we know, if there are thousands of people missing, they haven't turned up anyway in the last week. So a lot of people fear for the worst, obviously, for those people. But at this stage, the fact that so many people have left and so many people are still on the road, right? So there might be another 10 to 20,000 people just parked on the road. We're talking about a 100-kilometer long traffic jam, which is being deliberately slowed down by the fact that the Azerbaijanis have set up a checkpoint on the Hakkari Bridge, which, by the way, the International Court has declared to be illegal. And they're using the checkpoint to, check passports of everybody who's crossing. They're photographing everybody who's going through. Many people, especially fighting age men, have been really concerned that they would be abducted, because this has happened before, in which men who were being transported with either Russian peacekeeper or Red Cross protection and escort have been basically abducted by the Azerbaijani state and then put on kangaroo trials in Baku. One such man, only 2 months ago, was an old man in his late 60s, who, by virtue of his age, the Azeris assumed he must have been involved in the First Karabakh War, and therefore he must be a war criminal. And they they changed several times which specific war crime they claimed he was involved in. They accused him of being involved in 3 separate incidents, which Azerbaijan insists are crimes against humanity, somehow placing them on all those places. And they also showed different pictures purporting to be him, including one picture which was obviously of Armenian fighters in the Lebanese civil war from the 1970s. So basically, it was a case of they arrest an old man first and pin the crime on him later. So from Azerbaijan's perspective, having fought in this war against them is already a war crime in their minds. So but because of the fact that every Armenian over the age of 18 in the region has been conscripted into the local defense force, that makes every man a war criminal according to Azeri law, and that means that every one of them is potentially in danger of disappearing. So far, for the most part, the Azeris seem to have been letting them leave. It's almost certainly because of international pressure and continued international press coverage on the region. It's a bit too hot for them. However, they did, as you just mentioned, kidnap Ruben Vartanian, who's an Armenian billionaire slash philanthropist, who last year uh, got rid of his Russian citizenship in order to move to the region, where he was appointed for a short time state minister, which is the equivalent of a prime minister, something that the Azerbaijanis really didn't like. Now, of course, the Azeris are going to claim that they're arresting him for financial crimes in Russia, um, which is hilarious because Azerbaijan, of course, is one of the most deeply corrupt states in the world and one of the most opaque countries.
I mean, there's literally the Azerbaijan laundromat. That's how deeply involved they are in corruption, bribing people at the UN, bribing people at the EU, laundering money. I mean, the irony is just unbelievable.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and this is a thing where I think the Azeris themselves are starting to believe their own lies. To be blunt, because it's obvious that nobody else believes them anymore, right? Azerbaijan's relationship with the international community was always transactional. The European Union buys a laughable 3% of their energy mix from Azerbaijan, and yet somehow that's still enough to be an important or trustworthy partner, as the European Union's president famously described Azerbaijan. But there's no illusions.
That itself is, in a way, a very obvious sign of what these international organizations actually stand for. I looked into this, and Azerbaijan itself is in complete opposition to the EU Charter. 70, I think it's 80% of the EU Charter, the kind of things you have to pass to kind of be okay with the EU, the kind of EU values, by the EU's by the EU's own investigations and its own admissions. Azerbaijan breaks about 70-80% of them, yet they're their new favorite partner because of the gas. And for me, that was like, yeah, this is what it's about. It's nothing to do with morals or this and that. It's or values. It means nothing. It's all about that. And it's been really obvious in this war and this recent situation, particularly. All of a sudden, people are paying attention after it already happened,
Yeah, I mean, I saw that you posted the New York Times headlines where they said no one saw this coming, except that everybody saw this
Disgusting.
coming. I was with the reporters who wrote that article, actually, down in Goris, which was kind of funny.
Yeah, and Andrew Higgins and Ivan Nechporenko. Now it's a subtitle, so they probably didn't write the headline. It's a subheading. I imagine they themselves are pissed off with it.
They know what's up.
Right, yeah, and it's not their fault, but the New York Times, I mean, they should be fucking ashamed of themselves. One Google search, and you will see in the last 6 months, the last 12 months, I mean, me, myself, Popular Front, we've done about 7 or 8 episodes, but one Google search, you will see tons and tons of... I did a documentary there. Yeah, like exactly. Like it's ridiculous, and you will see that everybody knew this was coming. This has been written on the wall. People have been begging people like the New York Times to pay attention. People have been contacting congressmen. People have been discussing this openly. And the New York Times says almost no one saw this coming. It is just disgusting. How dare they say something like that? I don't know. It works me up, but it's just so bad to say that. It's like the last spit in the face after these people lose their land, lose their lives. And then the New York Times is like, well, no one saw it coming. It's just like, what are you talking about? Everyone saw it coming.
It had been clear. I mean, as I said at the beginning of the show, I think that since the 90s, for Armenians, this was an existential war. It was very clear in the narrative that Nagorno-Karabakh has to have some sort of self-determination, whether it's formalized or de facto or whatever we want to call it. But Nagorno-Karabakh simply could not be part of Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan is a country whose hereditary dictatorship makes the Kim family of North Korea blush in terms of how much it gets to get away with. And they have essentially turned hatred of Armenians into national religion in Azerbaijan. And therefore, the idea that these people would somehow just live in peace uh, inside of Azerbaijan was always ridiculous. It was ridiculous in the 90s, and it only just became more impractical as time went by and the rhetorics just got increasingly and increasingly uglier.
For anyone that thinks that's hyperbole or hubris, bear in mind there is a actual theme park dedicated to the murder of Armenians during the recent war. People can go there. Children are encouraged to go there by the government. You can see racist effigies of Armenians. Wedding parties go there for pictures. There's racist effigies of Armenians, helmets taken off the heads of dead Armenian soldiers, displayed for children. It's a theme park. It's not a museum to war. It's a theme park. It's a war crimes theme park. This is no exaggeration. Like, if I'm underplaying it, if anything. And also bear in mind that the government itself made sure that when the last war happened in 2020, drone strikes were screened in the capital city for the public to see, as if it was some kind of sport. So this is not hubris, what Raffi is saying by any means. Sorry, Raffi, continue.
Absolutely. Actually, I mean, speaking of that war theme park, indeed, they had set up these dioramas with these caricature Armenian soldiers with, sort of anti-Semitic looking facial features, if you can imagine, with exaggerated noses and so forth. The the curator, if you want to call it that, behind it explicitly mentioned that he tried to make them look as unhuman as possible, but so much so that they were forced to dismantle those after international pressure. But in a way, it was almost unfortunate because I remember seeing this one photograph of Azeri dictator Ilham Aliyev visiting one of these dioramas, and he's wearing a camo uniform. Which, keep in mind, right? This is a man who never served a day in his life, and he's standing there with these Armenian effigies, and you couldn't tell him apart from the caricatures. He looked like them. It took me a second in the photograph to sort of identify which one was the real life president of Azerbaijan and which one were mannequins of racist Armenian stereotypes.
Also, it's worth mentioning as well, anyone in Azerbaijan, of which there have been several people, they get sent straight to prison. There was a guy in the first war, within 24 hours of just saying online, like, this is ridiculous, why are we doing these war crimes, immediately sent to prison. So I know one Azerbaijani anti-government, anti-war group, and they are in total anonymity. They're very scared for their lives because you just get sent to prison if you talk against them.
Oh yeah, the only Azerbaijanis whose voices, whose anti-war voices that we've heard, typically come from people who are either on their way to prison or don't live in Azerbaijan. It's really that simple. But anyway, if it was hyperbole to say that it was an existential conflict for Nagorno-Karabakh before, starting with the blockade on December 7th, 2020, it became absolutely the case. And many Armenian and international analysts, as a local, actually a Karabakh-born analyst, Tigran Grigoryan, was saying, there were two scenarios possible at that moment. One was some sort of a deal which was reached with international pressure, and the other one was the worst case scenario, which would have been the ethnic cleansing or exodus of the entire Nagorno-Karabakh population, and that is right now what we are seeing. As you were asking me earlier, yeah, I suspect that virtually every single person in the territory who can leave will. We still don't know if Azerbaijan will try to keep some from leaving to create like a Potemkin minority to say, look, these Armenians live happily with us. It also kind of meets the expectations of the Russian peacekeeping force, because if the entire population leaves, then there's no one to protect. And by the way, to provide some more context into this conflict, it's quite clear that Azerbaijan's attack was greenlit by the Russians. right? And the geopolitical background behind it is relatively obvious. After the 2020 war concluded on November 7th, 2020, Russia was seen as the number one victor in the region because it reasserted itself as the only outside power that had to negotiate. Um, as a third party, Turkey would have been a distant second winner as far as we were concerned. But both sides had succeeded in isolating the United States and the European Union. However, when Russia's ill-fated invasion of Ukraine became quite apparent and the sanctions began to hit, the the um, the power balance in the region shifted considerably more towards Turkey and Azerbaijan, both of which Russia now heavily depends on for sanction busting and for support at the UN. So suddenly, Russia saw Armenia as increasingly disposable, um, despite having two formal alliance treaties with Armenia that commit Russia to protecting Armenia's territorial integrity, and despite the long-serving rhetoric of Russia being a protector of Christians in the Near East. Um, but the reality is, Russia needed something. Azerbaijan was ready to acquiesce, and the price was Nagorno-Karabakh, and possibly also a corridor that would connect Azerbaijan to Nakhichevan, which is an Azeri exclave, which then borders Turkey. Um, and that worked for Russia, so they didn't seem to mind. But the reality ultimately meant that Armenia now sees itself as uh, unable to rely on Russia as a security partner and has therefore been looking to democratize its security architecture. Armenia has been buying weaponry now from India, developing closer ties with France, and ultimately hoping that this um, Armenia's experimentation with democratic self rule would endear it enough in the Western structures for them to come to its protection. And increasingly, I would say people in Armenia feel like the world failed them. And I don't blame them for thinking that.
No. You've been on the ground there in Goris, the area where everybody is fleeing to, having had to leave their homes in Artsakh, in Karabakh. What's the situation like there? Explain to us. What have you seen? What have you experienced?
Right. So, quick recap. So, after the ceasefire on the 20th of September, uh, coupled and a few days of negotiation, the Azerbaijanis allowed the entry of Russian and then Armenian ambulances to evacuate the most seriously wounded from the fighting to Yerevan. But then word seems to have gotten out that the Russian peacekeepers would allow anybody with their own car to leave. And so what started as a trickle of vehicles kind of just passing through this Lachin corridor on Monday, by the end of the day, you were seeing convoys of buses. Uh, Typically, those people on the buses, by the way, were those people who lived in villages closest to the Azeri front line and were evacuated under fire during Azerbaijan's attack on the region, uh, and had accumulated or congregated on the main Russian peacekeeper base. So if you've seen those photographs of the airfield full of people, sort of Kabul 2021 style, that's who those people were. They were mostly from the villages in and around Martakert who escaped either on foot or were bussed out by the Russians. So they were amongst the first people to get out on Monday, simply because the Russians needed to vacate their base. They couldn't just keep these people sitting on the tarmac in the rain for 3-4 days. Uh, so these were the first ones to go, and then they were just followed by anybody with a car who can go, and that basically just got worse and worse as more and more people clogged that 2-lane road into Armenia. Initially, the setup was they would arrive at the Armenian village of Kornizor, where they would be processed and registered by the Red Cross. Then they would be driven to Goris, which is the nearest largest town, um, at which point they would be fed, given some water, hot clothing, and then either directed to hotels or various forms of accommodation, or sent along their way if they already had relatives inside Armenia who could take them in. Uh, but here we are on Wednesday, the 27th, and there have been so many people crossing the border that Armenian emergency services are close to being overwhelmed. Um, there are thousands of people who just drove right through and drove on to Yerevan without the slightest clue of where to go. And people now, various civil initiatives and NGOs have also been picking up the slack where the government has simply been unable to deal with the situation. So it's a humanitarian crisis, as you can imagine. 100 to 120,000 people moving into Armenia. That basically means that Armenia is seeing a 12% increase in its population overnight, literally overnight. So that's a lot to handle, and it's going to have serious repercussions on the country in the short to medium term anyway. And then, of course, there'll be the long-term questions of what they're going to have to do with these people, because they obviously will never be allowed to return to their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's really an awful situation, but at the same time, I could say that it's in these moments that I don't know, the Armenian spirit tends to shine. We've seen very touching moments of solidarity between aid workers, refugees, local people. People all over Armenia are signing up to come and volunteer, give, donate extra clothing, or allow people in their homes. I have a second apartment nearby that we're also putting up for refugees, and this is quite common across the country right now.
Popular Front is entirely grassroots and independent. Subscribe to our Patreon for hundreds of exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, and much more. It keeps us moving forward and you get lots of exclusive content. Subscribe at patreon.com/popularfront. When you speak to people there on the ground, what sort of things are they saying?
So some of the people I got to speak to when they literally stepped off the bus, I thought it was really important to record as many of their stories as possible while they were still fresh. Virtually most of the people I heard described some sort of atrocity to me. Again, because these were typically those people who came from the border villages, so they were attacked first. People told me stories of decapitation of their relatives who were not able to flee on time. Others told us about being targeted by Azerbaijani artillery despite not being near any military sites. And then they talked about basically having to flee through the forest on foot until they reached the Russian peacekeepers. They talked about living outside under the rain for 3 or 4 days. Others talked about bravery. A few people that I spoke to came from the village of Hinshen, which was surrounded entirely by the Azeris, and the mayor evacuated the entire population, and he was the last person seen in the village. I still don't know what happened to him, but he ensured that the entire population was able to leave safely. And I can attest that they arrived in Armenia. What's really striking, as I said, is that these are people who are known for being stubborn, but when the decision had to be made, nobody, not a single person, hesitated about the option of staying and living in Azerbaijan. They all knew what that meant. Nobody thought twice. Everybody left. I probably should also mention that while I was still there on Monday evening, we heard quite terrible news that a fuel distribution depot just outside of Stepanakert exploded while it was surrounded by people trying to fill up their cars with fuel. Because again, keep in mind, this place was embargoed for 9 months. So cars were literally idled and empty of gas. So it had been swarmed by people in their cars trying to fill up gas, and that exploded. And we still don't know what the number of casualties is. At least 60 people have been reported uh, to have been killed, and some 200 have been wounded, some of them with very serious burns. And in a rare example of concession, Azerbaijan actually allowed for the helicopter evacuation of many of these wounded to hospitals in Armenia, because all of Nagorno-Karabakh's remaining hospitals are completely overwhelmed already, dealing with the wounded from the invasion, and then there simply do not have the medical equipment, medicine, uh, or gear to deal with this, because they've been blockaded for 9 months, and the hospitals are empty. So, as if for a lot of these people, just um, the plight of having gone through 4 wars in the last 2 decades, and then having to leave their homes wasn't enough following a 9 month blockade. Now they had to deal with this situation on top of that. It's really tragedy on top of tragedy.
Were any of the people you spoken to in the kind of in the areas where Azerbaijan was directly bombing? Did they come in contact with the Azeri soldiers? What sort of stuff did they say?
Yeah, so for sure. So as I said, some of them fled when they were bombed. Others talked about fighting retreats through the mountains, in which the local Armenian soldiers sheltered them or shielded them as they left their village, and then gave them cover in order to leave. But many of them were within point blank range of Azeri rifles. Um, but of course, for anybody who's been left behind the line, it's kind of hard to say what happened to them. Their relatives say that they have no contact with them, but that could mean anything from they were killed to they're just out of reach, because Azerbaijan also targeted Karabakh's cell towers, communications nodes, water treatment plants. Basically, all of the critical infrastructure in the republic was destroyed overnight. So, communication with large swaths of the country was just lost. Um, so it's a bit of a paradox, because we have heard these stories, but they're also, by virtue of the fact that these are black zones, it makes them impossible to verify.
What was the state of people there? I imagine obviously they were extremely upset, having to leave their homes with whatever they can get with them. But did you see any injured, any wounded, anything like that?
So I don't even know if they're at a stage yet where they can be upset. I think many of these people were in utter shock. Some of the people I saw coming off of the buses were literally shaking, and I couldn't actually make out what they were saying, but just because their thoughts were clearly, um, mangled up. Um, many of them showed obvious signs of sustained malnutrition because they weren't eating. So, uh, I know I'm repeating myself again, but they've been under 10-month long blockade, and the last 3 months of that blockade was a total blockade in which literally nothing went in or out, including like Red Cross humanitarian aid or anything of the sort. However, in the villages, they have their personal crops. They were able to sustain themselves in one way or another, whereas those living in the towns like Stepanakert were heavily reliant on food banks and then essentially nothing at all. So many cases of malnutrition were very obvious. Um, there were a lot of touching scenes actually where the Red Cross and some of the volunteer organizations offered chocolate bars to some of the children, because the children had not seen chocolate in 9 months. You know, uh, and it was really moving to see. Um, I didn't see this personally, but a close friend of mine uh, did after I left. There was one person who had a active bullet wound in his leg, that had not been treated when they arrived. The Red Cross took him up and left. What I did see, though, is several of the cars, and seriously, several cars, civilian cars, had sort of bullet holes ripped across their windshields, like somebody just kind of took a gun and went, yeah. And I don't understand that at all. I mean, these were clearly civilian vehicles, and these were clearly strafed at point blank range.
I mean, it's clear what's happened, right? They're shooting at civilians.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's absolutely clear. But I don't understand how anybody would try to say it's anything but that. Right? There's no other explanation I can think of.
I mean, there's a lot of that. I have noticed they have shut down a lot of the stuff their soldiers were doing. There was talk on Telegram of soldiers offering to sell Armenian ears, which might sound an extraordinary claim, but in the last war, just dozens of Armenians had their ears cut off on camera, often by Azeri forces. There's a famous case. Cut open alive. Yeah, there was a kind of infamous case of an elderly couple. I think they're in their 70s, not even on the line of contact actually, and just some Azeri soldiers happened to wander over and just go in their house, and for no reason other than just hate, cut off their ears and murdered them, and took photos of it.
Yeah, that happened in 2016 in the village of Talish. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
they were the only two residents who couldn't flee, and they also were the only two residents who were killed. Like up until now, there is a near 100% certainty that if a Armenian civilian finds themselves within arm's reach of an Azerbaijani soldier, there is a near 100% chance that they will not be alive.
What are the Armenian government doing right now? I know their immediate thing was to say, yeah, we're not going to help the troops in Artsakh. But what are they doing now with all the refugees are poured over the border?
So yeah, just to touch on that quickly, it's true that on the day the fighting started, on September 19th, Nikol Pashinyan, the Armenian prime minister, came on national television, said that Azerbaijan was breaking all of its commitments, that what it's doing is illegal, insisted that the safety of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh lies entirely in the responsibility of the Russian peacekeepers, which is factually accurate in terms of the November 9, 2020 peace ceasefire agreement, in which Russia, not Armenia, now guaranteed the security of Nagorno-Karabakh. And then Pashinyan also just reiterated that Armenia was not actually involved in this, that Armenian troops were not in Nagorno-Karabakh, and that Armenia would not act. He then said that Azerbaijan was actually laying a trap for Armenia, in that they were hoping that Armenia would intervene, which would then provide a casus belli to turn this into a interstate conflict. So, because one of the two claims, so the two main claims that Azerbaijan was using to justify this illegal invasion was the first one was that it was a hotbed of terrorism, and that the local population was or the 10,000 strong armed bandits of Nagorno-Karabakh were planting landmines that were causing havoc and killing hundreds of innocent Azeris in the region. Of course, and they specify, of course, that these are anti-tank mines. A quick Google search told me that an anti-tank mine, or at least a Soviet-designed anti-tank mine, weighs roughly 4 kilo. So now what we're expected to believe is that these malnourished people with no contact with the outside world were able to sneak in landmines and then lug them behind Azerbaijani lines, despite all of the Israeli-provided security tech that they have, and then bury them across roads unseen, undetected, and then sneak back into their lines over and over and over again for years. Seems to be patently absurd to me anyway. Of course, it doesn't help that the specific incident in which some 3 people were killed by a landmine, including civilians. Again, I don't know why civilians were so close to the line of contact, but within 8 or 9 hours, this operation had been launched, and they already had the recorded messages in Armenian and in Russian. It's almost like they had actually been planning this for 3 months and not 9 hours, right? I don't know. I'm not a professor of military sciences, so I don't know, but I just assume that military operations of this grandeur take more than a couple hours to plan, right? It's almost like this was
You would think so.
was an excuse more than a cause, right? And the other excuse, the other accusations that they were lobbying was that the Armenian army, so the army of the Republic of Armenia, was still present inside of Nagorno-Karabakh, and this was actually one of the conditions in the 2020 ceasefires that the Armenian army had to pull out. For a little bit more context, the Republic of Armenia has its own army, and Nagorno Karabakh has always had its own army, but in practice, both were heavily integrated with one another. Obviously, the Armenian army shared a lot of technology and kit with the Nagorno Karabakh's army, but it is, as far as I know, it is true that Armenia completed its withdrawal of military personnel by 2021, so about a year after the ceasefire was signed. So there was definitely no Armenian troops there. The Armenians who were there were local militia, part of the local self defense force. But it's always in Azerbaijan's interest to imply that all these people are Armenian citizens, or rather members of the Armenian armed forces, because again, it removes local agency. It makes them all sound foreign. So from Armenia's perspective, they could Nikol Pashinyan anyway had to emphasize several times that there are no Armenian military personnel inside Nagorno-Karabakh, that Armenia is not involved directly in this fighting, and um, and that it would not intervene. The speculation, of course, was that Azerbaijan had put together a military buildup on both the borders of Nagorno Karabakh and Armenia's Sunik province, which is a very narrow piece of territory that connects Armenia with Iran. So that's a very critical border junction that Armenia just does not want to lose, because it's one of its only two borders to the outside world, since currently both Azerbaijan and Turkey are blockading Armenia and have been doing so since 1993. So it's theorized that by insisting on, it's very, by the way, just to be clear, and I think as Joe said on your previous podcast, like there was no realistic scenario in which the Armenian army, in the state that it is since the 2020 war, in which it's still trying to rebuild itself, would have been able to conduct a combined arms offensive 45 to 50 kilometers inside enemy lines in order to relieve Nagorno-Karabakh. And it's also likely that any sort of belligerent action on Armenia's side would have been taken as an excuse for Azerbaijan to try to widen the war at a time when Armenia was simply unable to do so. So, as painful as it probably was, I think realistically, sitting and watching was the only thing that could have been done there.
Yeah, I mean, no one's saying that, but let's not talk like Pashinyan is some kind of angel and he had his hands tied. I mean, when the millions and millions of pounds came into Armenia in 2020, immediately he started giving all of his staff bonuses and not supplying people that were meant to be supplied at that time. So I find it very hard to believe that, well, it's just poor little Pashinyan. Yeah, okay, he couldn't do anything, but I think he could have handled it a little bit better in the way he came out with it.
I mean, look, in general, for sure, I think the Armenian government certainly failed in terms of its foreign policy, both towards Azerbaijan and just in general. I think that this was a structural failure on both the Pashinyan government itself, but I think just in terms of Armenia's foreign policy stance over the last few decades. Just to make a quick interjection about the bonuses, though, because this is something that gets misunderstood a lot. These bonuses have been given consistently and across the board to all civil servants across Armenia. And it's basically just a legal loophole that allows the Armenian government to raise the salaries of its civil servants. Because there's this complicated tax law that makes it very hard to just raise the salary bars, so they compensate by providing bonuses. So I know that this has been misreported a lot in the news, where Pashinyan was giving hefty bonuses.
in the middle of the war, and there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of money. No, there's a lot of money not. There's a lot of money not accounted for as well that was sent into the country.
That could be true in general. Unfortunately, the reality
I'm
is
not
that
having this become like Pishinyan PR. I'm sorry, but I'm not.
no. But the specific idea about the bonuses is something that happens every month. But anyway, that's beyond the point. In general, yes, I think you're right that the Pashinyan government has essentially failed to live up to its commitments towards the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and towards protecting Armenia's sovereignty in the face of increasing encroachment by Azerbaijan. Now, in terms of what's being done right now for the refugee crisis, it seems that some contingency planning started roughly around July, when it became clear, as I stated earlier, that this was going to be a very realistic scenario. There have been several visits by USAID into Armenia, likely to start the planning for what they were hoping would never have to happen. The Pashinyan government said, actually Pashinyan himself more correctly, said that they had prepared accommodation for up to 40,000 families across the country, although it's unclear what they mean by that. It's unclear in which areas of the country. And it's obvious that they're hoping that as many people as possible who do have relatives in Armenia will become essentially burdens on their own families as opposed to on the state. But yeah, right now, as I probably already reiterated earlier, like the plan that they have is to try to shuffle everybody towards immediate forms of housing, and it could be dormitories, hotels across the country, so on and so forth, and also to provide them, I think, with some amounts of cash, because the region having been blockaded again for 9 months meant that they had essentially reverted to a barter economy.
Jesus, what a horrible situation. So what do people need like right now, like on the border, like if people are getting food? I know there's a lot of volunteers, but what's like the most immediate situation?
So the most immediate situation really should be housing and probably some amount of direction. I think that uh, as the number of people is increasing, it's likely that the emergency services personnel are going to be less and less capable of dealing with everybody, and some people are going to start slipping through the nets. Um Speaking of accommodations, apparently some people had been offered housing in villages that were on the Armenian Azeri border and refused it, saying that they did not feel safe being so close to Azerbaijan. So that is a consideration that needs to be taken into the future, that not all housing is necessarily appropriate housing. Um, but yeah, so in the very immediate terms, we're talking housing, food for at least a few weeks, and warm clothing, because we're at the end of September now, and outside of Yerevan, especially in the regions of Sunik and Vyotsdor, which are very mountainous, it gets cold very quickly. And many of these people basically left everything they had. They literally came with the clothes on their backs. So that's in the immediate term. In the long term, there's obviously the question of a more permanent settlement solution for these people, because, as I said, Armenia just is experiencing a 12% jump in its population overnight. There's going to be political repercussions for this. Many of these people in Nagorno-Karabakh are obviously feeling that they were betrayed by the Armenian government. Some of them may or may not want to join anti-government protests, which is another concern for the Armenian government to want to deal with in terms of the political stability of the country. Others, we're talking about tons and tons of people who just showed up, who don't have jobs, they don't own property, they don't have anything to do, especially a lot of fighting age young men. Um, so this is another challenge for both Armenia and the international community to try to solve. With that said, Armenia has secured some funding from the international community. The European Union allocated 5 million euros in emergency funding to Armenia to deal with the situation, and that includes food, medicine, housing assistance, but also psychological assistance and things like that. The United States, um, Samantha Power, who is the head of USAID, was in Goris yesterday, where she announced that the United States was going to allocate $11.5 million to Armenia. Sweden allocated 1.3 million. France allocated 7 million euros, and of course, Russia just gave Armenia a formal note of protest because they're unhappy with the government's anti-Russian stance.
Jesus Christ. In the midst of all this, they're like massive babies.
But that said, that the Russian, I mean, while I was there, the Russian peacekeepers had been moving in convoys of fuel and flour into the region, but nothing on the Armenian side. I think they've been more concerned because right now the Russian peacekeepers and the Red Cross are the only two, let's call them third-party organizations, allowed into the region, into Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan. So Russia has, first of all, a formal responsibility for the protection of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, and they're also the only party that has the logistical capabilities of actually providing that first sort of aid. But the one, I don't want to call it a silver lining here, but because Azerbaijan insists that Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, the crossing of these people into Armenia means that they officially get refugee status as far as the UNHCR is concerned, which gives them a certain amount of rights, especially rights to unlock special funding from UNHCR and a number of other governments. So there is help on the way. The UN is present. UNICEF has a whole cargo load on the way that just made it into Armenia that's supposed to be there to take care of kids, reunite families, and things like that. So there is definitely an amount of mobilization.
No, it's good, but I find it leaves a very sour taste in your mouth when for 10 months people have been starved in the area. Several people have actually died of starvation, I think, right, in Stepanakert and nearby because of Azerbaijan's blockade. And like now it's like, oh, now we're going to help. It just seems crazy that this has just happened like this. I mean, what happened to like never again? It's like never again so long as there's some kind of economic or strategic advantage for us via you. It's so dark.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at least a couple people are known to have died directly from starvation. It's also worth pointing out that starvation, the causes of death that are related to starvation aren't simply not eating. Typically, starvation also impacts other health conditions that many of these people have, right? So they're not eating, which means they're weaker, which means they get sick faster, which means maybe this person died of a fever that wouldn't have died if they were properly nourished, right? And then just the fact that they're not getting medication. I mean, a lot of people died of heart attacks, right? A lot of people who otherwise had access to heart medication, to blood thinners and things like that. They simply didn't have it. And a lot of them actually died during the fighting of heart attacks, right? Several cases have been reported of people just dying because the shock was too great. They weren't killed necessarily by Azeri bullets, but they were essentially killed by the war itself. Yeah, so it's absolutely dire. On the other hand, while I accept the insanity that you just described of the world not reacting unless there's a direct benefit to them, I still think that there's no such thing as too little too late, because this situation is not over. Half the population of Artsakh is in Armenia, but that means the other half has yet to come. These people are also going to need housing and food and medicine and warm clothing and a house to live in, work, jobs, some cash to spend, etc., etc. And then on top of that, I mean, Armenia's national security is also under threat by Azerbaijan, because the Azeris, of course, have signaled that they're not planning on ending with Nagorno-Karabakh. They now have designs towards Armenia's Syunik province, which they want to partially annex in order to connect Azerbaijan with Nakhchivan proper. So, it's really not so much too little, too late. It's more of a better late than never situation in my mind.
Yeah, I agree, but it's just a shame that it's come to this. And I don't know, man. I see it as well from my perspective as a reporter. The pure lack of reporting on it is just criminal. It's just unbelievable. And it really does, for me anyway, it's shown that like our industry is full of vanity. It's a lot more popular. It's a lot more beneficial for a war reporter to cover one war than the other for their own personal profile. And I get it. Yeah, everybody needs to eat. We all need to make money, and this is where the money is. But Jesus Christ, it doesn't cost a lot to at least talk about it on some way.
And there's a flip side to that scenario as well. Like, as you say, some conflicts are more attractive than others to cover, and malicious actors will bank on that. I mean, Azerbaijan has definitely been using, for example, the way more popular war in Ukraine coverage as cover for its actions, right? I mean, these two conflicts are intricately connected to one another. Azerbaijan, actually, the 2020 war, as I think you know very well, was essentially timed during a U.S. election so that news coverage would be focused elsewhere. And a number of the escalations that came up right before this most recent attack on Nagorno-Karabakh were also timed more or less with major military developments on the ground in Ukraine when it comes to offensives and counteroffensive and so on. So definitely, it's unfortunate that conflicts like these don't get the coverage that they do. It's also true that certain countries, certain actors rely on us not hearing these stories, and in some cases, sometimes the worst part is that people are watching and they are listening and they're not doing anything. That's almost worse than suffering in silence, is knowing that everybody's watching you in real time. People are saying that this is a genocide that's being live streamed.
Are the people on the ground talking about it like that yet?
Oh yeah, that's been the refrain over and over from anybody you ask, from old people in Karabakh to some of the aid workers on the ground. Everybody talks about how unfortunate it is that they've basically been abandoned by the world, and it's also, I think, part of an existential debate inside the Armenian community between those who feel that they have been ignored and those people who believe that it doesn't matter if the world looks at you. We should only rely on ourselves, right? And so, like, Armenia's failures in this situation are a result of our own lack of introspection. The idea here being that you have to make if Armenia doesn't matter to the world, then we have to make the world matter, or rather, we have to make Armenia matter to the world so people will pay attention. As one person I overheard saying, one of the aid workers was saying that, whatever happens in Israel, whether you're pro-Israel or pro-Palestine or you don't care, like you know about it because it's on the news, because Israel is important enough to the world that whatever happens there will get reported on. And in a way, the burden is on Armenia to make itself an integral part of the world puzzle.
That is incredibly sad. And it's sort of, war reporting is meant to make that not as important, but with the mass corporatization of media and the hugely biased attitudes, basically whatever UN says is true. Like, I've literally seen journalists argue, well, the UN said that it belongs to Azerbaijan. It's like, okay, well, there's a monastery, an Armenian one, that is about 100 years older than the UN. But still, that doesn't matter to people. It's like they see geopolitics as a football match, and it's really sad that it's come to this. I don't even know what to suggest.
It's also a really odd argument, right? To say that because of a very recent concept of territorial integrity, that's basically a carte blanche to do whatever you want inside the territory. And as if borders don't change. I'm from Canada. Specifically, I'm from Quebec, a province that was given two opportunities via referenda to manage its own affairs. In both cases, of course, the people of Quebec voted no to independence, but they were given that choice under a constitutional framework which exists and is part of democracies. Um, so it's really odd to me, especially when you consider the fact that Azerbaijan itself didn't exist until 1991. It was part of the Soviet Union, so it itself understands the idea that you can vote for and then receive your own sovereignty based on democratic principles, if you so wish. So it's very odd that they don't then reciprocate and provide those same rights to people that they insist on wanting to reintegrate into their country.
Absolutely. And I think it's a case where journalists unfortunately say we're on the good side, we report the good side, which is insane to me as a concept. If you're a war reporter, if you've seen the horrors of war, to still then have that attitude. No, I'm not saying all reporters are doing this, but I have definitely seen a chill come across war reporters when kind of I'm like, why aren't you talking about Karabakh? You're, everything on the ground in Ukraine, rightly so, but why don't you then care about this area if you cover it? And there's definitely a feeling of like, oh, don't mention that, Jake. And it's like, no, this is what we're meant to do.
And the comparisons to Ukraine too are so superficial, right? I mean, like Karabakh is not Crimea. Karabakh was never under the control of Azerbaijan. It basically came out of the Soviet Union, not part of Azerbaijan. Crimea was part of Ukraine until 2014. The people of Crimea also, as part of Ukraine, voted for independence from the Soviet Union. And Armenia, I mean, Armenia is not Russia, right? I mean, Azerbaijan likes to portray Armenia as an invader, like Armenia invaded 20% of Azerbaijan's land and it's this occupier, and so just like Russia is, except that Russia is the world's largest nuclear power and also the largest landmass in the world, whereas Armenia is a tiny country the size of Belgium with 3 million people in it. Russia had agreements to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It had all of these international commitments, and it broke all of them. It is in no way comparable to the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it's perhaps odd because Azerbaijan uses a lot of the rhetoric of Ukraine, but it uses a lot of the tactics of Russia, right? Like it does a whole territorial integrity, we got invaded, so on and so forth. But the parallels between Aliyev's actions towards Nagorno-Karabakh and Putin's actions towards Ukraine are quite glaring, both in terms of this idea that a dictator can use military force to create new realities on the ground, both in terms of just the use of military identification codes and turning those into like symbols of their war effort. Russia famously started using the Z symbol. Azerbaijan in turn used that upside down A. A lot of the rhetoric, the comparisons to World War II. Azerbaijan refers to the 2020 war as the Great Patriotic War, which is exactly the terms that Stalin used, of course. And they refer to Armenia as the fascists, which again is what Putin calls Ukraine. Even though Armenia, regardless of people's views on the current government in Armenia, is relatively a much more democratic state, which elects its own leaders. And Azerbaijan basically finds itself in the neighborhood of Eritrea and Somalia when it comes to freedom indexes.
There's a lot of ironies. The irony of, like you said, Azerbaijan, a country with internationally recognized unfair elections. Like, they're the ones telling Armenia that they're the fascists. This is the same country as well now saying, well, these are our borders. They're the borders that Stalin implemented to kind of court favor with Ataturk at the time, right? Like, this is arbitrary.
Yeah.
And like all watched under by the UN. Is, I don't know, you couldn't make it up.
And they're arbitrary in a way that were never designed to actually be concrete. In so many of these cases, like, we don't actually know where the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan is. Azerbaijan, as we speak, is still finalizing its borders with Georgia and Russia, right? It's been for the last 30 years. These are two countries with which Azerbaijan has peaceful relations, and they still haven't agreed to where their borders are. So as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, it's very odd that this this lack of clarity always goes in one direction. So if Azerbaijan doesn't know where the border is, it's always further west, not closer east. It's always inside Armenia, right? Because at the moment, Azerbaijan occupies something like 105 square kilometers of Armenian sovereign territory that they've been slowly chipping at since the 2020 war. But by that same logic, if you don't know where the border is, maybe it's on the eastern side of Nagorno-Karabakh. Why not?
Well, they call Armenia Western Azerbaijan sometimes, right?
Yeah, well, that's increasingly become part of the Azerbaijani state rhetoric since the 2020 war, but especially in the last year, the Azeri government created a gongo called the West Azerbaijan Community, which is advocating for the peaceful return of the indigenous Azeris into Zangezur or Western Armenia or whatever, which obviously is meant to mirror Armenian historical claims to the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, right? And it's a political tool more than everything else. And in the same way that if we want to make the claim that the Armenians took the side of self-determination in terms of their understanding of international law, and the Azerbaijanis insisted on territorial integrity as being primordial, that was obviously just an excuse because they were pro-territorial integrity when it suited them. But now that they've got it, now they're pro-irredentism. Now they want to get more stuff, and they're going to come up with other international law justifications to try to encroach more into Syunik or the rest of Armenia.
What is going on with that? So Azerbaijan is occupying areas proper in, I think it's South Armenia. What's going on with that? They're just there. They're not going to leave. No one cares.
It's more like think about it as a 1.5 mile deep sliver that slices all the way down the eastern or parts of the eastern Armenian border. So they've encroached along a very wide front between 1 to 2 to 3 kilometers, depending on where they are. These areas are high up in the mountains. Armenia had not previously established any defensive perimeters there because before that was the border with Artsakh. It was not the border. Artsakh, of course, being Nagorno-Karabakh, it was not a defensible border at the time. And the Azeris, with the November ceasefire being signed on November 7th, that area was already under heavy snowfall. So the Azeris kind of waited until the next May in 2021 for it to melt, and then they sort of just jolted inside before Armenian troops had a chance to properly dig in. And then in 2022, they advanced in some other areas as well, most notably near the Armenian town of Jermuk, where they got to within 5 kilometers of the town before being pushed back out. But essentially, we're talking about a 1 to 2 kilometer wide sliver of land that just does the length of Armenia in certain parts anyway, which collectively build up to about 100 or so square kilometers. And they also include small slivers of, this is them occupying some 100 or so kilometers of Armenia. It also includes small bits of Armenian territory or official Soviet territory in the very northeast of Armenia, so where Armenia and Georgia meet Azerbaijan, that corner. Because on a map, it's kind of a very vague shape, and then the trenches basically ended where they were. So in some places, the Armenian trench line is somewhat within Azerbaijan, and other places, the Azeri trench line is closer inside of Armenia. So, but all these connected make up a little over 100 square kilometers Armenia that's currently being occupied by Azerbaijan, which ironically is a big proponent of territorial integrity.
Wow, what a mess. I could talk about this all night, man, but I got to go. But where can people contact you and find your work if they want to? And I really recommend they do, because you're really on the ball with all of this and you've been on the ground and you're out there. So if people want to talk to you, they want to know, they want to get information directly, how can they do that?
Sure. The best way to reach me is just on Twitter. I know that's cliche because all your guests say that, but it's just at Raffi Elliott, RAFFIELLIOTT. So 2 F's, 2 L's, and 2 T's. I mostly just shit posts, but some people think it's fun.
No, your work has been excellent, man. Your video stuff as well. So it's not all shit posting.
Thank you so much.
That was the Popular Front podcast. If you want more exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, and more, subscribe to patreon.com/popularfront. We're entirely independent and grassroots. Nobody owns us. Patreon keeps us going, as does our merchandise. You can get Popular Front apparel and accessories at www.popularfront.shop. You can also buy our various publications there, like the Popular Front magazine, which is available now. We're censored on social media and streaming platforms, so please do follow us and share our content. Watch our documentaries at youtube.com/popularfront. Follow us on Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfront_. And for uncensored updates on the world at war, follow our Telegram at popularxfront. If you want to keep track of my work, it's the same on all socials at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. For all those links, go to www.popularfront.co. The music in this episode was produced by Sam Black. Check him out at samblackpf.com or search Sam Black PF on Spotify. Intro music is by Home. Thank you to this episode's sponsors. This episode was sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. This episode was also sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue 97239. Let them know that Popular Front sent you, and you will get a discount of some kind on your coffee there. Thank you to the high tier Patreons: Evan Kale, Peter Cherry, Lupe Calderon Garnica, Cyril Geist, Thomas Giuseppe, Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Justin Katuna, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Benjamin Tupper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Damien, Cameron Collins, Matthew Diffley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Atiro Raphael Macias, Ethan Schwick, Peter Nybratton, Gabriel K, AG Barcelona, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Don, LD50 Seattle, Adam H, B Rambo, Larson, Ivan Julien, Björn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Michael O'Connor, Nicholas Butter, JD, James Karpinski, Jav, James Cully, Ethan, Fitzmadrid, Ed Coulthard, D-San, Mike Barone, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, DZA, Jojo Arani, Vegan Straight Edge Global Cabal, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Michael, Neck, Freya Northman, Neba, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Bike Lane Bowser, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochran, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Chad Walker, What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumwalt.